So the temptation is not sin, but it's definitely rooted in our sin nature, and it's something that we need to flee and mortify.
So this is really helpful because sometimes even in the apologetics community, when this topic comes up, when people do, I've done lots of Q&As where this will be thrown in a very hostile way, like, well, what do you think about homosexuality? And then you're kind of on the spot. And sometimes, and I've said this, I'm sure, and I've heard other people in the apologetics community say, well, when we talk about homosexuality, we're talking about same-sex behavior. So I wonder if you might help me clarify my language on that. How would you advise me to begin talking about that rather than just, because I think I might be guilty of that at times, like separating, like just making it about the actual behavior, but we don't do that with other sins.
Right.
If we have a lust in our heart for even, within a heterosexual attraction or something, if there's lust in your heart, if Jesus talks about this on the Sermon on the Mount, well, that's sin. So it's not just, having promiscuous sex in a heterosexual sense that's the sin. There's more to it. So help us in the apologetics
Yeah.
community. How can we word this better?
Well, Alisa, I'm, there's been a journey as well. So I also would say, it's just the behavior that's wrong, but the attraction isn't. I use that same, 20 years ago when I was just coming out of prison and I hadn't been to Bible college or seminary. So I just said, it's just the behavior that's wrong, but the attraction isn't. But as I studied it more, that's where I realized this whole conversation around whether same-sex attraction is sinful or not. We're not defining our terms. I mean, isn't that like the number one rule? Define your terms. And we're not defining attraction. And then we're debating over it. And so I think it's best because everyone has all these different, definitions. Some say attraction just means temptation. Some say attraction means desire. Let's just use those words, the biblical terminology. Like whenever we can, let's just use biblical terminology and not the other terminology that could confuse. Of course, I still use the phrase same-sex attraction kind of just generally, but when we're talking specifically about ethics, that's when I said, okay, then now let's parse it out and say temptation and desire. Whereas temptation is not actual sin, but it's definitely rooted in original sin. So a lot of times people really, this is another thing, critique of side B gay Christians. They just limit sin to actual sin, the actual behavior, where actually the doctrine of sin, actual sin is just a small aspect of the doctrine of sin. We're talking about original sin. We're talking about our sin nature. We're even talking about indwelling sin, all these very important concepts that go beyond just the act of sin. So the temptation is not sin, but it's definitely rooted in our sin nature, and it's something that we need to flee and mortify. Desire, it's not that desire turns into lust, but actually the same word in the Greek New Testament for desire is the same word that we sometimes translate as lust, epithumia. It just depends on the context. But getting back, like, what would be a healthy way? I want people to first understand, like, what do you think about homosexuality? I think what I would say is, first of all, every person needs to follow Jesus. I mean, that's the main issue. So we need to treat every person with dignity and respect. Same-sex relationships are sinful, but it's not the worst sin. And so we need to point people to Christ, that we need to say that we need to make sure that even not only our behaviors are to be sanctified, which is progressive, but also our thoughts and our desires need to be sanctified, and helping people to kind of parse that out. And even if you give in, right? I mean, Christians, we still sin, just hopefully we're sinning less and less. We're not sinless, we're just hopefully sinning less and less, right? The kind of little catchphrase. And I think that's helpful, because what separates us, before I came to Christ, I just was in bondage to my sin. Now, I'm no longer in bondage to my sin. That doesn't mean that I'm not tempted. I still am, but I'm no longer in bondage to my sin. So I think it's pointing people to, when people ask, what do you think about homosexuality? I would say, well, this is the behavior and the desire is sin. Temptation is not sin. It's not a sinful act, but it is rooted in our sin nature. But we need to encourage people that this is not the worst sin. there is hope for any sinner, of any person dealing with their indwelling sin, but ultimately the goal for every human being is that you need to follow Jesus. And what does that mean? Deny yourself, pick up your cross daily, and follow him.
That's good. That's good.